me now. So I'm excited you're here. We'll see if anybody else joins us, but if not, this is a perfect group. And it's nice to have an intimate group for a class that is definitely a little bit more conversational. And that's how I want this class to really be. We're discussing what we're kind of coining as alternative California. But I want it to be an open discussion, and I want it to be an exploration of maybe grape varieties or vineyards and producers and regions that we're just not as familiar with. So in no way is this meant to be, to look down on any of the more established wine regions of California or the more established producers. We owe a great debt of gratitude, as we'll talk about with some of the history of California that we'll discuss briefly. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to, a lot of these bigger players in California. And of course, we would never want to discredit that. But I really just wanted to have a class that would give us an opportunity to have a lighthearted conversation and sort of bring attention to some of these lesser known producers, right? Some of these lesser known regions, grape varieties that we've heard of, but maybe we've thought of as being less favorable than Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon or Sauvignon Blanc, right? Or grape varieties that we know in other parts of the world like Spain or Portugal, France, coming to California, Italy, and what they can do there. So it's meant to be fun. It's meant to be an opportunity to give us the option to taste and drink fun wines and more exciting wines. And then the other thing we'll talk about too is it's not enough just to be like, let's talk about Carignan coming from Lodi or Melon or Melon de Bourgogne coming from Chalone, right? We also need to discuss the kind of blockbuster wine or grape varieties that we can find for a more economical price in other parts of California, outside of maybe Napa Valley or outside of the Russian River Valley that are really well known for these particular grape varieties. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Excellent. All right, so let's just get started. Have a little fun tonight. I hope that we have a smaller group. I hope that you'll ask questions if you have any questions. I hope that you'll make comments. Rick, I saw you already posted what you're enjoying tonight. I put it in my backpack already because I'm definitely taking this home to have with dinner tonight. Sometimes I like pour in a little bit of the wines that we taste for class, and then we sell them by the glass. But every now and then I'm like, this one's coming home with me. So I'll be talking about the Sandlands a little bit later on, as well as the Jolie-Laide. These are both two producers that you're going to hear a lot about, especially Tegan Passalacqua. We're going to talk a lot about what he's doing in California because he's everywhere. He's everywhere there. He has his hand in everything that's going on, which is really, really fantastic. Rachel, since you just opened the Sandland, pour it, have a little bit now, and then just kind of, I think I poured myself a little bit about an hour ago or so because I wanted to sort of be able to see the evolution of the wine in the glass, and I think it's just really beautiful. And it's a very pretty wine, which I find to be very different. I don't think there's a lot of great things about Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, but it would rarely be something that I would describe as pretty. And that was kind of one of the first thoughts that came to my mind when I first kind of smelled and tasted this wine, is that it's very pretty. It's ethereal, it's light on its feet, but it packs a huge wallop of aroma and flavor, which are kind of sometimes unusual in wine. When we think about a lot of flavor in wine, we usually think about a lot of body and impact on the palate as well. So I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm talking about the wine before anybody else has had it to drink, before we know what we're talking about. So we're going to cover, of course, a little bit of background and history. The history is more of the classic history of California. We're going to go through it pretty quickly, but as always, it helps us to understand the culture We know who was there, how they got there, what are those mountain ranges doing, what type of soils were created in that place, right? What is the culture? And in California, especially, one of the things, I've been to Napa, I think 4 times, and I've, spent a little bit of time in some of the areas in California, but not a lot in terms of the wine growing regions. But I think it's so fun every time I go, or every time I begin to dive into the producers. It's an area where you start to recognize names over and over. You're like, wow, Rory Williams of Calder, who's making like Charbono and Riesling in Napa Valley, is the son of John Williams. Then John Williams started Frog Leap with Larry Turley. Larry Turley sold his part of Frog Leap back to John and went on to start Turley Wine Cellars. Tegan Pasalacqua, the owner and winemaker for Sandlands, is also the winemaker for Turley Wine Cellars as well. He learned under Aaron Jordan, who now makes wine for his own label, Fela. So you really begin to see this really cool kind of symbiotic atmosphere and environment and kind of ecosystem of the winemakers and the ideas that they share with each other, which is really cool. So we're going to talk about the kind of like some of these new school regions, and most of them, what's really fun is maybe we shouldn't call them new school, maybe we should call them like neoclassical, because a lot of these regions that we're going to talk about are pre-prohibition regions with a lot of pre-prohibition vines, right? So they're not really new regions, which is pretty fun. So we'll talk about Paso, we'll talk about Lodi quite a bit. Sierra Foothills, Mendocino, Santa Barbara, Contra Costa, I think is really cool. It's not an AVA, but we'll talk about the county. So why else would we discuss some of these other regions in California? Maybe we want to go somewhere other than Napa or Healdsburg, right? Maybe we want to explore the Santa Cruz Mountains. Maybe we want to spend time in Sierra Foothills, an area that's a little bit more isolated. It's not as Disney-fied as Napa Valley, even though I don't really like to say that, because I think that Napa Valley is actually very bucolic. I think when you spend a week there, you get to see the small producers and the rolling hills and the vineyards. And Napa has really enacted a lot of environmental protection around the valley itself, which is why it hasn't turned into something like, kind of like Salinas, or a place that had previously had lots of grapevines that have been taken over by urban expansion. So that's not actually going to happen in Napa because of all of the cap that they put on for either ripping out vineyards for urban expansion, or even where you can actually plant vineyards. So one of the other reasons that makes Napa wines or Napa vineyard land so expensive, because of all of these environmental protections, right? Costs a lot to buy a vineyard, it costs a lot to farm, and it costs a lot to plant. So we might think about looking to some of these alternative regions that have a great wealth of old vine material. The land is not as expensive. And if you're a younger winemaker, like the Sierra Foothills and Lodi and the Santa Lucia Highlands and Mendocino, these areas are like Napa was in the 1960s and the 1970s. It was inexpensive to purchase an old vineyard that was run down and rebuild it, or an old winery and rebuild it that had been built pre-prohibition, right? So we see a lot of these younger winemakers that can't really afford to make wine in Napa Valley, and they're seeking out these areas outside of Napa and outside of Sonoma. And a lot of these areas, as I mentioned, have a wealth of old vines already at their disposal. They have wineries also that have possibly been there since pre-prohibition, but the land's a lot less expensive too. And it also gives a lot of younger producers an opportunity to work with grape varieties that we're going to discuss. So we'll talk about Zinfandel, of course. Zinfandel doesn't seem like much of an alternative grape variety, but it's so incredibly important to the fabric of California winemaking. We'll talk about that, certainly. We'll talk about the Central Coast, Paso Robles. So Paso Robles is really important to discuss. I'd love to go and visit this area and see that really crazy shift between the more cooler coast and the more arid inland that we do have here. We'll talk a little bit about Santa Barbara, as I mentioned. We'll talk about this area south of San Jose. I didn't put together like a slide on like the Santa Cruz Mountains. I thought about doing like a slide on Livermore Valley, but there's just not as much there. So we can kind of discuss some of those regions without seeing slides specifically on them. So we know a lot about the background and the history. The vines are not native to America, although we did have native wild American grapevines, but these grew on the East Coast. So we don't really think that we had any native grapevines that grew on the West Coast of the North America, I guess we should put it that way, back at this time. A lot of colonists were attempting to make wine with American grapes on the East Coast. They were repelled by the flavors of these particular wines. We began to bring Vitis vinifera up the coast from Central America, what was Mexico, into what would become the United States, planted it in places like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and of course, what would become California. And this was really important to the fabric of pioneering in those days. A lot of missions that were spreading up and down, especially the California coast. The most northern of those was in Sonoma, the mission San Francisco de Solano. If you've been to Sonoma, the town square, that's where the mission originally set. George Yount arrived in Napa and planted the first vinifera vineyard in 1839. I don't know that he ever actually owned his own winery that he made wine from. But one of the things we'll talk about today is, you know, not every grape grower or wine grower, you hear these two terms tossed around, and sometimes grape grower versus wine grower is an indication to the philosophy around the quality of farming the grapes and what you're farming them for, right? So sometimes you'll hear this distinction. I always say this, like a good metaphor for that would be like Syrah versus Shiraz. In California, some producers call the same grape, right? Some producers will call it Shiraz. Usually if you see Shiraz, they're indicating that it's made in more of that kind of, kind of fuller, riper, richer, higher alcohol, more bombastic style that we kind of know of in places like sometimes in California, sometimes in South Africa, and sometimes in Australia. If you see Syrah on the label, it's probably that winemaker telling you through that verbiage that we're talking about a little bit more restrained, food friendly, maybe slightly more kind of peppery, herbal, or herbaceous style, right? So you can kind of think about grape grower versus wine grower the same way. How are you and what are you actually farming these grapes for? Agustin Harasti found one of the first really important wineries in Buena Vista in Sonoma as well. He was incredibly important and still today because he was commissioned by California to actually write a book on the grapevines of California. So he wrote a text that you can still find today. And more importantly, he traveled throughout Europe and he brought more than 300 different grape varieties back to California. So a huge wealth of grapevine material came with Agustin Harasti, who was a really kind of fun character in the 1850s. In the 1860s, 70s, we begin to see some of the really important wineries that we still talk about in Napa today. Charles Krug. We're going to talk about Charles Krug because we're always going to talk about Robert Mondavi. You have to. You always have to. I just recently read a book about the Mondavi family. And I can't remember what it's, something Mondavi. Maybe somebody knows the one I'm talking about, but it's a really terrific book on the history of Napa Valley and the Mondavi family. So we'll talk about this, of course. They purchased Charles Krug, the Mondavi family, in the 1940s, post-prohibition. But prior to that, even though Napa Valley and the image of Napa Valley is congruent with the Mondavi family and with Robert Mondavi, the family itself, actually, Robert Mondavi grew up in Lodi. So we're going to talk about that today. Schramsberg, of course, Beringer, Inglenook, phylloxera came, devastated the region. After we were beginning to come back from phylloxera, we have prohibition. Now we think of prohibition as really kind of being almost, a full stop to everything wine in the US. And although it had a huge impact, this is not necessarily true. And there were some regions that we'll talk about today, like Lodi, that actually benefited from prohibition as a grape growing community. So not necessarily for making wine, but for growing grapes and shipping those grapes around the United States for home winemaking. It's pretty exciting. When we came back from prohibition, we lost a lot of our technical know-how around making wine. A lot of the equipment that we needed to make wine was in disrepair or out of date. A lot of the vineyards were in disrepair and out of date, of course. So it really wasn't until the 1960s that we began to really see a comeback in California and American wine. And Robert Mondavi really started this comeback in the 1940s when his family bought the Charles Krug winery. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, he had a row with his brother Peter, and this ended up with him kind of being ousted from the Charles Krug winery. So prior to his ousting at Charles Krug, Peter had always been the winemaker, and Robert was he was kind of the showman. He was the marketing manager. He was the face of the brand who traveled around California and traveled around the US and even to other places in the world and promoted the Charles Krug wine. So after he was ousted, he started his own winery, which was, of course, the eponymous Robert Mondavi Winery, starting in 1966. I mean, they were still building the winery when they started their first vintage, their first harvest in 1966. I think the grapes were crushed outside because they hadn't put a roof on the area where they were crushing grapes yet. In 1976, Stephen Spurrier organizes the Judgment of Paris, and wines of California beat French wines in a blind tasting, both a Chardonnay and a Cabernet Sauvignon. And this catapults, of course, the California wine region, and especially Napa Valley, onto the global stage and onto the global market. So this is when the world takes notice of California and it takes notice of Napa Valley. And now today, I think this is also, this history, it seems like, so 1976 seems like a long time ago now. But when we think about it, it's not that long ago, right? And so we think of California wine, we automatically think of Napa Valley. But Napa Valley is only 4% of all of the wine that is produced in California itself. So important to understand that it doesn't make a lot. I mean, Napa Valley, if you've been, it's not that big. In terms of the actual area where we make wine, it's much larger than just the valley itself, or maybe not much larger, a little bit larger than just the valley, but it's like 30 miles from north to south. It's not really that big of an area. So 4% of the wine. We also see a second round of phylloxera. And after the second round of phylloxera, we begin to replant a lot of those sort of more Italian and Spanish and Portuguese grape varieties that we had all over California with the grapes that brought critical acclaim to Napa and California, right? Which was Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. So you see where we're going with this. How did we go from all of these incredible heritage vines that Agustin Harassi introduced, right? These Hungarian, these Portuguese, Spanish, these Greek. Actually, I don't know if he brought Greek vine, but it just seems like he would have. Austrian and German grape varieties, right? Like, where did they all go? They were here, but they tended to get ripped up and replaced. And outside of Napa Valley, in a lot of these regions that we'll talk about today, Lodi and Livermore and Contra Costa, the vineyards really survived, maybe because somebody was just tending the vineyard on a break from their day job and then kind of selling the wine in bulk to somebody like Fred Franzia, a Bronco or Treasury Wine Estate. But you see where I'm going with all of this. In 1981, Napa was named as an AVA. We see the rising prestige. In 2008, when we have the financial crisis and the housing boom or housing drop, a lot of the bubble around kind of the big cult California wine dropped, right? And we see right after that a lot of a return to not just producers, but also to guests and wine drinkers and wine lovers, moving away from that kind of 80s and 90s push for more alcohol, more ripeness, more oomph, more oak, 200% new oak type of thing, to these cooler climates, lower alcohol, and off the beaten path grape varieties and regions. And in 2013, this book called The New California Wine, which is like, sure, it's almost 10 years old, but this is a phenomenal, phenomenal book. And I would highly recommend it. I mean, you can probably pick it up for under $30. I've had it for years. If you're interested in California wine, if you're interested in off the beaten path producers, wine regions, I highly recommend it. It's very well written. And it's been a great reference for me for this class. All right, history, so much fun. Thanks for sticking with it. So many of you have probably seen this slide before, but I think it's always a fun way to illustrate things with the pie chart, right? In 1926, you can see primarily what was planted: Alicante Bouschet, Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, Carignan. This is known as the mixed blacks. So a lot of these old vine vineyards are based on these grape varieties. They're often planted as what we call a field blend, meaning rather than neat, tidy, trellised rows of each grape variety in blocks, they're interspersed with each other. And this is for a number of reasons. One, because prior to ampelography, when we were planting vineyards in the 18 and early 1900s, we didn't always know when we went to the nursery and bought Zinfandel that was exactly what we were getting. It's more common, especially during this time, but sometimes even today, to replant one vine at a time rather than an entire vineyard. So it depends on what your prerogative is in terms of selling wine, but you think about if you rip out an entire vineyard and you replant the whole thing, you're usually waiting, at least 4 years to make wine, and then usually 6 to 10 years to make really good wine. So that's a big issue, right? A lot of money that you're leaving. But if you replant one vine at a time, you can still use the rest of that vineyard. So you might replant within the vineyard with something that wasn't Petit Syrah or wasn't Carignan or Trousseau, right? 2016, you can see that Cabernet is king in California. And I think this actually now I'm doubting myself, and I can't remember if these graphs are for Napa or for all of California. They might just be for Napa. So you see that Cabernet is, almost half of plantings now. We have Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, still some Zinfandel and Pinot Noir, but a big shift in 100 years in terms of what we were making before. So why did we have these mixed black vineyards, and how did they survive to today? And then why are we going to talk about these regions that have these old vine vineyards, right? So during Prohibition, of course, the sale of alcohol was illegal, but you could purchase grapes to make wine at home. So there were some regions in California that tended to have more fertile soils. They had a lot of heat. It was easy to grow a lot of grapes and also to grow grape bunches that were big. They had beautiful, plump, big berries on them. Now, this is due to sometimes certain grape varieties like Zinfandel, Carignan, and Alicante Bouschet tend to have bigger berries, especially when they're irrigated or farmed in fertile soil. So they looked really nice when you took a picture and you put it in your magazine, as you can see here, and you pick the grapes via the picture that you wanted for your home winemaking or grape juice or jelly, right? 1 car of California Zinfandel grape for juice and jelly and other purposes, whatever those other purposes might be, home winemaking, medicinal winemaking, right? And so this was the reason a lot of these old vine vineyards survived. So even though Prohibition was a huge kind of stain on the winemaking history of the United States and of California, there were some areas that actually benefited from it. And now the Mondavi family was one of those families. So Cesare Mondavi moved with his wife Rosa from Italy. I think they were from like Marquette, from Italy to first like Michigan and then to California. They were from the coastal Italy. They did not do well in the Michigan climate. They went there, they had like a cousin or a brother or something there first. They moved to Lodi. And so Robert and Peter Mondavi, they grew up in Lodi. And the family initially made their money kind of during this time, during Prohibition and then just post-Prohibition, because they were working with a lot of grape growers, and they kind of brokered a lot of the contracts between winemakers, grape growers, and these grapes that were being shipped to other places in the country. So this is how they made their initial money that they then used to purchase the Charles Krug winery in Napa Valley itself. So cool, right? So we understand the idea of the American Viticultural Area, or AVA system, a system of how we label our wine. So if we put a grape variety on the label, 75% of the grapes or the wine in the bottle has to be from the stated grape variety. 95% must be from the stated vintage, 2019, and 85% from the stated AVA. Now, these are the rules, meaning this is the least amount of this grape variety, this vintage, or this AVA that you'll have in the bottle. Not that every winemaker or every winery is only putting 75% Cabernet Sauvignon in your bottle, right? This is just the minimum that you have to have in order to use these terms on the label. We have larger AVAs or regions like North Coast that can then have smaller sub AVAs nested within them. So Napa Valley is inside of North Coast. Rutherford AVA is inside of Napa Valley. And then you can also list a specific vineyard if the grapes are coming from that vineyard. In this case, we're using Trailside Vineyard in Napa Valley as an example, also located in Rutherford. So some culture, some style. Now, oftentimes we think of kind of California style being lumped together like one kind of large state, right? How often do we say like California wine? But these regions really have their unique features. The climate can be intensely different depending on where you go in terms of closer to the coast, further inland, or in altitude, or north to south too, right? California is a long state. There's a big difference between Northern California and Southern California. The big difference between San Francisco and Los Angeles in terms of the climate. We're a young industry, so we have the opportunity to experiment. We have a lot of the entrepreneurial spirit of the New World, where we are determining what grows best where, and we're really starting to understand and kind of take a few pages from the playbook of matching specific grape varieties and clones to terroir. And we're doing this much faster than was ever done within the old world in places like Spain and France and Italy and Greece, right? Because in these places, we learned which clones and which grapes were best in what areas through natural selection over centuries or millennia. So we're doing this in a very short period of time in the United States. There's a lot of great collaboration, both between old and new world winemakers, and then between winemakers, just in California or in specific regions. It's very common for winemakers to share facilities in wineries. It's very common for them to share equipment in vineyards. It's very common that most of the producers of the wineries that we're going to talk about today own none or very little of their own vineyards, and they purchase grapes. Sorry, and they purchase grapes from other vineyard owners who they have a contractual agreement with, and those vineyard owners will farm the grapes the way that they prefer, and then they pay them usually a much better rate than they were getting from some of these really big wineries on the side as well in California. I think that's some of the funnest things that we really do, right? And that's fun for us because I think as wine lovers, we love to experiment too. All right, so we're gonna start kind of north to south, meander our way down as we talk about some of these areas. The point, of course, is never to just talk at you and be like, yeah, like Ruth Lewandowski likes to make Italian grape varieties, and you find Ant Hill Farms and they like Pinot Noir and Syrah. But the point is to just kind of put these wineries or these regions on your radar. Most of these areas you've probably heard of, but we'll just kind of break it down and talk about a few of the reasons we love this area, and then the producers who do make wine there. So you'll see too that oftentimes we might mention a producer who's making wine in a region that's not located in that area. So you won't see things like estate bottled, right? Because one, they don't own the vineyard, and two, they're not in the same region, their winery itself, as they're purchasing grapes to make the wine. So we'll talk about that in a second too. So Mendocino, just north of Sonoma, just north of like kind of the west and north, what we call the true Sonoma coast, which we're not discussing today, but I'll throw in a little bit about that here because I think it's important to talk about too. So it's sort of centered at the confluence of the Russian and Navarro rivers in the southern portion of the country. And you have the smaller sub-AVAs inside of Mendocino of Anderson Valley, really important for Roederer Estate, Potter Valley, Redwood, McDowell, the Yorkville Highlands, which used to be incredibly important prior to Prohibition, but you are seeing wineries like Jolie-Laide, Purchase, Syrah, and other things like that from the region now. Cole Ranch, parts of Mendocino Ridge, which is an AVA based on elevation. You have to be above, I think it's like 1,244 feet, something, I could be off on the number, but something around there to call your wine Mendocino Ridge. To use the AVA, you have to be at a certain elevation. The coast is much more cool and marginal. So traditionally, when these areas were being explored first for grape varieties, you saw a really big focus on sparkling and white wine. Louis Roederer, when they came to the US, a lot of the sparkling wine houses, champagne and cava houses that were looking in the United States for a sparkling wine region to start a house in California, most of them went to Napa. A lot of them did, right? Gloria Ferrer, we had Chalone, they came to Napa Valley, but Roederer went to Anderson Valley. And Roederer going here really put this AVA on the map, so it was really important for them. And I think if you're looking for American sparkling wine, the Roederer estate wines are absolutely delicious. They are the traditional method, kind of Champenois style that you'll find from the same grape varieties. They do a really fantastic job for an American sparkling wine. I think they're absolutely great. We're beginning to see more Chardonnay, Gamay, and Pinot Noir that are really becoming important to the area, especially as we're closer to the coast. So when you move inland, as you're moving towards Ukiah, and we should probably look at like the map again, right? Because we think about this long coast, and we know that those coastal regions are always heavily affected by the Atlantic Ocean. We have a lot of mountain ranges on the coast. And when you have these sort of traversed valleys and these mountain ranges or gaps in the range, you know, you have that vacuum effect where you have this really hot, dry interior of California that sucks all of that cool Pacific air in through these gaps, right? So it covers a lot of these mountain vineyards in fog, brings a lot of these valleys like Napa have a lot of fog within them. So as we are moving inland, we're almost always talking about regions that will support grape varieties that want more sun. We're going to talk about that in a second when we get to talking about the Sierra Foothills. So we'll find more Cabernet Sauvignon, Zinfandel, Merlot as we move a little bit further inland into Mendocino towards like Cole Ranch, towards Ukiah. Poe wine is incredibly important here. There's a lot of certified organic viticulture in the area, which I think is really cool. About a quarter of the vineyards are certified organic. Navarro, really well known for their white aromatic wines. So we see things like Riesling and Gewürztraminer coming from Navarro. Poe wine, Samantha Sheehan. She has a tasting room in Napa Valley called Outland. You probably heard me talk about it before because it's shared with two totally different winemakers than her style, which is why I love the Outland tasting room so much. Because if you're with a group of people in Napa and everybody likes a different style of wine, you can all find something you like at Outland. So you have Poe wines, Samantha Sheehan, which focuses primarily on Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Gamay, more in a Burgundian style. Most of her wine does come from Mendocino, but not all of it. You also have Matthew Rorick of Forlorn Hope, who also, just like Tegan Pasalacqua, just like Arnaud Roberts and some of these other producers we're going to talk about, really seek out unusual wines or blends from more unusual regions around California. And he makes a lot of micro bottlings of these different vineyards and different wines. And then you also have Tom Farella. His winery is located in Coomville in Napa Valley, and he focuses on Bordeaux grape varieties. So a little side note. So you go to Outland, get something for everybody. It's in downtown Napa. Radio Coteau, one of my favorite wineries for Pinot Noir and Syrah. They primarily purchase all of their fruit. They work with smaller growers. They work with the Savoy Vineyard, as does Literai in Anderson Valley as well. Beautiful Pinot Noir coming from Savoy. William Selliam, also based in Sonoma, just like Literai, but purchasing fruit from this northern AVA. Lioco is here, Ant Hill Farms. Ruth Lewandowski primarily focuses on Italian grape varieties. So that's something really fun in the area. You'll see him working on, his name is Evan. I think the winery's named for, I think Ruth was his grandmother, but I could be wrong if I'm remembering correctly. But he works with a lot of Italian grape varieties that he finds in the area. Barbera, Dolcetto, you'll see other producers working with those grapes too, and some Italian white things like Fiano. Really fun, different styles of wine that you might find in the area. So we're talking about the coast, right? Mendocino, just above Sonoma. Now we're moving inland. So the Sierra Foothills is this kind of hills and small mountains that rise up from the Central Valley. And this elevation is incredibly important in making the Sierra Foothills a quality area for grape growing. Now, Sierra Foothills this is gold rush territory. This is where, gold was first discovered at Sutter's Mill. This is what caused the gold rush to California. And we know through history, of course, that a lot of immigrants and prospectors and then people that needed to support this burgeoning population in California, they all came out during this time. And unfortunately, when they didn't strike it rich, or when the gold was thought to have been all found, a lot of them couldn't necessarily afford to go back to wherever they came from. So they stayed in California. A lot of them fell back on previous professions that they might have worked prior to coming out to California for gold. And that does include Mike Skinner, who's the great grandson of a prospector that came to California. He found gold, and then with his gold, he started one of the area's first wineries in the Sierra Foothills. So it's kind of a cool legacy that they have here as well. We do have a long, even growing season, but because of the elevation, we don't have that brutal heat that we have in the Central Valley below. One thing that's really important about the Sierra Foothills is they're one of the only wine growing regions to have a lot of granite. We don't see a lot of granite or limestone in the wine growing regions of California. A little bit of limestone in Ballard Canyon, in Santa Barbara. There's a little bit of outcroppings here and there. So when we think about granite and we think about what grapes we like to grow on granite in France, we think about Gamay, we think about Syrah, and we think about Grenache as well, right? Rhone grape varieties, and then the grapes coming from Beaujolais, granite. So we're seeing, aside from these sort of older vines of Barbera and Zinfandel that were planted prior to Prohibition, we're also seeing a lot of exploration with Grenache, Gamay, and then other Rhone varieties here. So, Syrah and Mourvedre are really important too. We have some really cool wines made from, especially a lot of like skin contact, more natural style producers, Albarino, Petit Manseng, Rodeo, Peakpool, all being made within this area. Luxurine Farms is a really fun winery. The wine can be pretty funky. And so sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. They really follow, a very easygoing approach, hands-off approach to both farming and winemaking, based on the works of I think his name is Chuck Fukuoka. I can't remember if that's his first name, but the really kind of hands-off approach to farming, but they make a lot of really great wines. I usually love their whites. They tend to be really high acid, but textured and super interesting as well. Skinner, I talked about Mike Skinner, the great grandson of a prospector. Bill Easton, the great producer in the Sierra Foothills. He had two labels. One is Easton. It focuses more on like Zinfandel, Sauvignon Blanc, some Cabernet Sauvignon. and then Terre de la Rouge, which focuses on Rhone grape varieties. So a lot of blends, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre blends. Edmond St. John making Gamay, also sourcing grapes from Lodi too. Andy Erickson, Savia, they get grapes here, Donkey and Goat. RPM, which is a winery from Arnott Roberts, the two that run Arnott Roberts, and Rajat Par that only makes Gamay. So this is their project. They got together. They're like, we want to have a winery that makes just Gamay. Rajat Par, of course, is making, you know, Pinot Noir and Syrah and Chardonnay and Santa Barbara. Arnott Roberts makes wine all over California from these smaller vineyards. They're making Gamay together from the Sierra Foothills, Dirty and Rowdy, also really fun winery that you might find in the region too. So Contra Costa, we don't have a lot to say about this. So I kind of read in this book that, you know, Contra Costa is kind of the kind of area like you'll turn down, you know, kind of a really crappy road that goes behind a Jack in the Box, and you drive down it and you'll see like an old refrigerator on one side and like an old couch on the other side. And then at the end of this road is this old vine vineyard. We're talking about Evangelo Vineyard, I think in this particular case, or Del Barbara Vineyard. But it's an area that these old parcels of vines really survived through a lot of the area's growers who just work the vines in between their day jobs, just as kind of like almost a hobby or a second income that they would get once a year. They would sell their grapes to the bigger houses. And when we think about these bigger houses, when we talk about like box wine and Favia or your $6 California red blend that you can get at the supermarket, they just buy fruit from all over California. And they buy a lot of inexpensive fruit, and it could be this really phenomenal old vine fruit, but they don't care. They just buy as much of it for as cheaply as they can and make inexpensive wine to sell. So what's really important about some of these kind of growers and winemakers that we're going to talk about is that there's people like Tegan Pasalakwa who are going and in his truck and driving around and like keeping his ear to the ground to find out about these vineyards. So Tegan has started, along with some other friends, Morgan Twain Peterson and others, sort of an old vine heritage project in California to save a lot of these old vine vineyards. And so you can see this is Evangelo Vineyard here, the Bedrock Winery that's located in Sonoma. Morgan Twain Peterson is incredibly important. So Morgan Twain Peterson is the owner of Bedrock. He started this winery with his partner. His dad is Joel Peterson, who founded Ravenswood. Joel Peterson used to work for not Rod Berglund, for Joseph Swan. Rod Berglund runs Joseph Swan now. That's Joe Swan's son-in-law. But Joel Peterson worked for Joe Swan in Russian River Valley. Then he started Ravenswood, incredibly important winery and historically for Zinfandel in California. And Morgan, his son, Morgan, really grew up in the vineyard, always been around wine, always been around vines. He's, aside from a winemaker and vineyard owner now, he's also a master of wine. So along with Tegan, they're really looking for a lot of these old vine vineyards. And so I've really been beginning to see Del Barba and Evangelo pop up on bottles of wine. These are wines that are labeled as California. So Contra Costa is a county. The Contra Costa is a political designation. So it's not actually an AVA, but because a lot of these producers are understanding that there are some great old vine vineyards here, they're buying for. We do Sandland, Bedrock are all here in Contra Costa, working these vineyards. You can't see so well, but these are just really, really old vines that we see. So moving on to Lodi. We kind of talked a little bit about Lodi already. This is where the Mondavi or Mondavi family, as it used to be pronounced when they lived in Lodi. This is where they kind of made their first fortune that allowed them to purchase Charles Krug and then allowed Robert Mondavi to go on and start Robert Mondavi Winery. Think about how different the history of what we would be talking about right now would be if these things had not occurred. It's pretty crazy, right? So we don't think so much about Lodi, but we owe Lodi a lot of respect and, as I mentioned before, a lot of gratitude for its history in California wine culture, and also for what they're doing today. So one of the really fascinating things about Lodi is they have a, a long history of agriculture and grape growing. And I mentioned before sort of that difference between grape growers and wine growers, right? There's a lot of pride here. In Lodi, you see a lot of not, generation after generation winemakers, but generation after generation grape growers, 3, 5, 6 generations of grape growers here in Lodi. An incredible wealth of old vine vineyards, which we're going to talk about here in a second. They make a lot of wine. They are located in the Central Valley, but the thing that makes Lodi different and a step above the rest of the Central Valley in quality is its location within the Central Valley. So they're located just to the east of the Sacramento and San Joaquin River Delta. So this is an area, I mean, I forget what they call it, but you can bring like ocean liners in here. Like it's actually, the Delta is so incredibly deep. The Delta itself is below sea level, and this brings a lot of cooling effect to Lodi. So even though we're in the Central Valley, it really is like the Sierra Foothills because of that elevation, a unique area that actually makes really fantastic wine. Because of that, it grows a lot of grapes. It's home to nearly 40% of California's top-rated Zinfandel. There are 7 sub-appellations. This is because, again, just like we talked about the coast and the inland, if you're closer to the Delta, you have a little bit more cooling influence, right? You also have a different soil type. We don't have as much mountain influence as we do as we begin to get into the eastern edge of Lodi, and we see like Clermont and Borden Ranch and the Slow House AVAs when we're sort of up in the mountains and the hills, and those ones have elevation. So you will begin to see some producers starting to put probably sub AVAs on the label. Now, this wine coming from Lodi that you see the Sandlands we're drinking, the vineyards that we're talking about are in the Mokolumne sub AVA that's over here, like kind of closer to the Delta. And this is considered to be one of the best that we really see in the area. So we have both these small growers and winemakers, but we also have a lot of large value-oriented brands. So when the Mondavi family started to make some of their more accessible, they started the Robert Mondavi Winery to be a very high-end boutique winery, but they wanted to start some more accessible brands. So when they started Robert Mondavi Woodbridge, a lot of the grape would come from Lodi. They knew a lot of people in Lodi already. Again, Robert grew up here. But they also have a lot of these smaller boutique wineries. Many of them specialize in this old vine Zinfandel production, but there's a lot of other grapes here too. Marcus Bokish specializes in Spanish grape varieties in the region. He spent a lot of time in his youth in Spain. His family was from there originally. And so he wanted to focus a lot on Albarino, Graciano, and Tempranillo coming from Lodi. So incredibly important here. Mettler makes some really fantastic wines, more Bordeaux inspired, Cabernet Sauvignon. And then let's talk for a second about the vineyard. So we're going to talk about kind of 3 main vineyards that are really important within Lodi that were all planted, 100 years ago or more. So the first is the Kirschenmann Vineyard. We've been talking a lot about Tegan. We're going to talk about him more in a second. Tegan was able to buy a vineyard in Mokolumne AVA in Lodi, and I think it was like before 2010, sometime in the 2000s, he purchased this vineyard. I can't remember exactly when. It had been owned by one family for a very long time. They were really reluctant to sell, but they realized that Tegan had been farming a vineyard nearby the Kirschenmann Vineyard, and they saw what great care he was taking of this vineyard. He had converted it to organic viticulture, and the family really wasn't able to take care of the vineyard and the vine. They didn't work in wine. They didn't have anybody to really run the vineyard. So they ended up selling the Kirschenmann Vineyard that you see here to Tegan Passalacqua. Tegan Passalacqua, his main day job is as the winemaker and vineyard manager for Turley Wine Cellars. So now he owns this vineyard, has a ton of old vines in Zinfandel material. Kirschenmann was planted in 1915. Its own rooted vines within this area, which is pretty cool. But because it's mostly Zinfandel, he doesn't make Zinfandel under his own brand. Well, why doesn't he do that? It's too much of a conflict with Turley, right? He should be out for Turley looking for these old vine vineyards for Turley specifically, not for his own brand. So for now, he really sells the majority of the fruit that he farms in his own estate vineyard to Arnold Robert. He sells it to Turley. He sells it to Morgan Twain Peterson at Bedrock. He sells it to Randall Graham at Bonnie Doon. He sells it to Abe Schoner at the Scholium Project. So all friends of his that he gets to see how they sort of take his grapes from his vineyard and express them through their own wine, which is pretty cool. So what we have in this bottle that we're going to talk about is a blend of Kirschenmann Vineyard and Bechtold Vineyard. Bechtold, Turley also makes a old vine Trousseau. If you've ever had it before, it is kind of like this wine. It's really light. It's really ethereal. It's very beautiful style of wine that you think when you think Turley and you think about, you know, Turley is Burgundian in its approach to Zinfandel, but the wines are still usually pretty full and rich on the palate, right? Because we're still talking about Zinfandel, we're still talking about California heat. But the Trousseau from Bechtold is incredible. It's like I said, just really light on its feet. It kind of dances on the palate, which sounds a little bit romantic, but if you can find the wine, you'll understand what I mean. A lot of beautiful red fruit. And when we see these old vine wines, what we get is, as I kind of mentioned with this wine that we're drinking here, you get this sense of tons and tons of flavor and aroma, but without a lot of palate weight. It's really a fascinating experience on the palate that I think that you don't get in so many wines, because you just don't often find Trousseau that was planted in 1886 and is still own rooted, right? So Bechtold is the oldest continually farmed vineyard in Lodi. Schmidt Vineyard, also really important, 1918, planted Zinfandel too. And so you'll see, you know, when a lot of these vineyards were planted, like in the 18 and early 1900s, pre-prohibition, you know, we didn't put vineyards on the label. These vineyards were not really named for the reason of having Bechtold or Kirschenmann or Trailside or Chalone on the label, right? The idea of naming these vineyards, or the fact that they now have names, is usually an homage to probably the first families that would have owned and farmed these vineyards. So I think it's a really cool homage to the past and to the history of immigration in California, that a lot of these vineyards have kept the names of the original families who farmed them. Paso Robles, I really want to go here. I'd love to hear it if somebody else has been. So I mention it because it's a really great alternative region for Cabernet Sauvignon blends outside of, you know, Knights Valley or Alexander Valley in Sonoma, and of course outside of Napa valleys. But in addition to the great Cabernet blends that you might see coming from producers like Justin or Ancient Peaks, we also see a lot of Rhone and Italian grape varieties. So Rhone varieties are really important in this area. Paso Robles is a huge, huge AVA, 650 acres in total, but only about 40, I have it's 650,000 acres in total. Sorry, this is a typo. I didn't put it right. But only 40,000 acres of those are actually planted to grapevine, but you can see the potential for expansion. We did split this into 11 sub-AVAs in 2014 because of this huge tract of land, right? Just like we've been discussing, it's really difficult to generalize about a Paso Robles style when you have such a huge area that the grapes are coming from. So again, we can generally say that closer to the coast, we're going to be seeing a little bit more of these water and cooler Pacific influenced wines. And then as we move further inland, we see definitely more of the Zinfandel, the Cabernet, the heat lovers, the more arid interior of the state, right? A couple of really important producers that we see making a lot of Rhone grape varieties too. Saxum, the really important producer in the area, he kind of put a lot of the Paso Robles, Rhone varieties and Rhone style wines on the map as well. There's some limestone here, so we don't really see a lot of limestone in California. As I mentioned, some in Ballard Canyon, but there is some here. The soils are really, really complex. They're not homogeneous. So we have a lot of different soil types, but you do have some limestone. So this does allow some of these Rhone varieties to retain acidity, even if they push 15 or even more percent in alcohol. So Saxum is really known for, the winemaker's name is Justin Smith, and he's really known for having these kind of big, rich wines, but they are balanced, even when you have like a 15.5% alcohol wine. And I would say Turley is the same way. You have these wines with high alcohol levels, with a lot of flavor, but they're still balanced because they're still making the correct decisions for pick time so that there's still enough acidity in the wine and how they treat them. And again, when we farm carefully and consciously, we know that balanced vines are going to make balanced wines, right? So this is important too. Cobblers Creek is a mother lode for Rhone vine material. Cobblers Creek was founded, they looked at starting it in Sierra Foothills, but settled on Paso Robles. It's a collaboration between the Perrin family of Chateau Beaucastel in Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the Rhone Valley in France, and the Haas family. It's a family of American importers that represented Chateau Beaucastel. And so the story essentially goes that Robert Haas worked for his brand, Vineyard Brands. They were the only importer to represent Chateau Beaucastel. So he would go to the Perrin, then he would bring their sons and tour around the United States showing their wines with them. So the family became very close. They decided to start a project. Jason Haas is the winemaker who runs the winery today. All of the cuttings that they have in Paso have come from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. They've all come here correctly, meaning they have all 13 grape varieties. They all went through quarantine for a very, very long time before they were released. But I think just within these past few years, they've actually released all of the grapevines they brought from France out of quarantine. So that's important. Napa Valley we'll gloss over. We've talked a little bit about it, but I think, you know, it's not all Cabernet. It's not all Merlot. It's not all Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. And if you go to Napa, I think that this is important because it's really fun to be able to balance your tasting so that you're not only drinking Cabernet Sauvignon, right? You want to look for those kind of smaller wineries that might offer a little bit something different. You should, of course, taste Cabernet Sauvignon because you definitely miss out if you didn't have that experience there. But you might look for producers like Stony Hill or Smith Madrone or Trefethen or Calder by Rory Williams, John Williams' son, who all make really fantastic Riesling. Stony Hill and Smith Madrone are up in the Spring Mountain District. Trefethen on the valley floor. Calder, I don't know actually where he gets his Riesling, but he works a lot in Calistoga, Rory does in the north. Chapelet, making fantastic Chenin Blanc in the valley. Matthias and Forlorn Hope, Grassi, Massacon, Dan Petrosky is also the winemaker for Larkmead, are making wine from the Italian grape Ribolla Gialla. They all make it in a different style. Some of it's skin contact, some of it's oaked, some of it's really fresh and crisp. So it's a really cool opportunity to see. And I think all the Ribolla Gialla come from one vineyard too. Turley, Robert Foley, Schrader, Calder making Charbono, another very historically important kind of prohibition style grape. Bialy, Chapelet, Lagier Meredith making Zinfandel. Lagier Meredith is Steve Lagier and Carol Meredith. Their wineries in Mount Veeder. Carol Meredith was the plant geneticist who found the relationship between the Zinfandel grape and the fact that it was actually a Croatian grape. So they grow Syrah, Malbec, Zinfandel, but they named the Zinfandel, they call it Tribodrag. So you might see Tribodrag from Lagier Meredith coming from Mount Veeder, which is really cool. Their wines are absolutely fantastic. They age really well. They're meant to age. You can drink them. I mean, I would give them like, 4 to 10 years. They could go for longer, but they'd be really great in that style. Santa Barbara, we've talked about, quite a bit. And again, I just wanted to offer this more as an opportunity to think about something aside from sideways and Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So we're also within the Central Coast AVA. For a huge variety of climates and styles. Again, we're thinking that bend in the coastline at Point Conception. So you have two sides that have that really cooling influence, but as you're moving further inland, you're always going to have warmer, riper, more heat-loving grapes. We see a lot of Grenache, Zinfandel, and even Cabernet coming from the interior of Santa Barbara as well. A tribute to Grace is incredibly important. Angela Osborne for the Grenache style wines, the Grenache wines that she's making. She also makes some wine from further south outside of LA, like Cucamonga and Temecula as well. Piedra Sassi, Stolpman, Jim Clendenin, unfortunately, winemaker that just passed away a few weeks ago, but made really beautiful Bourgognian style Pinot Noir and Chardonnay for his winery Au Bon Climat. But he also started a second project, Clendenin Family Wine, for more obscure grape varieties. So he also worked a lot with Italian grapes, Friulano. He made Nebbiolo. I think the best Nebbiolo that comes out of California, coming from Bien Nacido Vineyard, a little bit further, a little bit north of the town of Santa Barbara and Lompoc. Liu D focuses on Loire Valley grape varieties. Sorry, it took me a second to get that out. They have Gamay, they have Melon, they're making Sauvignon Blanc. What else are they making? They make Chenin Blanc. Melville focuses on, they do some Chardonnay, some Pinot Noir, some Syrah, Tatomer, Riesling, Gruner Veltliner, and tribute to Grace, Angela Osborne. We're only talking about Grenache. I always say she makes mostly Grenache, but I've never seen another wine from her that's not Grenache. So I'm gonna start working on saying like mostly Grenache. She makes all Grenache. So I'd love to hear for those of you that do have these wines tonight. I don't have the Jolie-Laide open, but this is a favorite winery of mine. They're based in Sebastopol in Sonoma. So Scott and Jenny Schultz. Scott moved to Napa from Chicago. He was the wine director at Thomas Keller's Bouchon, one of the restaurants just down the street from the French Laundry, as are many of Thomas Keller's restaurants, like Ad Hoc, French Laundry, Bouchon, kind of all in a line there. But he does not own any of his own vineyards, as far as I know. Purchases all of his fruit from organic growers around the state. And this allows him to really farm and make a huge range of different styles of wine. And I think that's one of the other fun things is like, from a philosophy perspective, is winemakers are usually pretty curious people. And they usually want to see what they can do with fruit from different places. So it's really fun for a winemaker to have the opportunity to make each year maybe something a little bit different, right? They'll have contracts, they'll work with the same fruit every year, but sometimes those contracts expire, or sometimes they have to replant a vineyard and you might be looking for something else a different year. So this is coming from Chalone. So Chalone is an AVA within Monterey. We're just inland from like the Santa Lucia Highlands, but there's a bunch of fun like Carmel Valley. You have Arroyo Seco, which is important for Randall Graham of Bonnie June. And then you also have Chalone, a little bit further inland in the Gavilan mountain range here as well. If you have the bottle, I should have put the picture here, but I thought the picture of Scott drinking a beer while Jenny doing pump overs was a lot more fun here. But every year, because the wines are a celebration of the year and the season of which they're made, they change the label every year as well. So each year they commission an artist to do the labels for them that they promote. In 2018, it was artists at the Creative Growth Art Center, the nonprofit kind of art center in Oakland that serves artists with disabilities. So it gives them a professional studio, a good environment for artistic development and representation, and also like a professional gallery for exhibition. So a really kind of a fun thing to think about. This is fresh, it's salty, it ages on the lees, so it does have some texture to it here as well. Okay, so I've been talking so much. This wine has been sitting in this glass for over an hour. Rachel, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on this, but so I've been talking about Tegan Passalacqua all night. If you didn't know him before this, you know him now. Winemaker for Turley, winemaker for Fanland, champion of old vine vineyards, really working to showcase these farmers that have farmed for many generations, but just have not necessarily had representation. So you can see him here, and I'm not sure if this is, I think this is him in Kirschenman vineyard itself, but I could be wrong about where this picture was taken. I got it online, but you can see these old head trained vines, and you know these are vines. You can't mechanize these vineyards. You have to work everything by hand. So this is his 2019. He calls it Red Table Wine. Again, I think a little bit of an homage to the winemaking culture and history of the California of the past. It's a blend of 3 vineyards and 3 grape varieties in equal proportions that is intentional. So it's the Trousseau from Bechtold, planted in 1886, Carignan from Spencer Ranch, planted in 1900, and then Zinfandel from Kirschenman, planted in 1915. It's incredibly fragrant. It smells like a really nice perfume. It has kind of like rose petal and spice, cherry and cranberry. There's like a little bit of this kind of almost like talcum powder, like rose water talcum powder characteristic to it. Smells a little bit like Turkish delight. Like really concentrated fruit and spice and rose water.
Yeah, and there's really sorry to interrupt, Amber. It seems like there's more of that, like as it opened up. Like it smelled really good an hour ago, right after I'd opened it, but the kind of almost chalky, you know, sort of chalky sounds bad, but you know, it's not quite that. The flavor chalkiness like that with all the berry flavors and some herbaceous flavors, it's very nice. So in any event, I don't want to take too much of people's time.
No, thank you. I'm glad. I love hearing what somebody else's opinions. For me, the flavor, it had so much flavor. Like it had, like, if you know, it reminded me of eating, I've said this before, but kind of like almost like a fruit snack where you've taken all of this flavor and you've like concentrated it into something, you know. I mean, it feels almost kind of like in a way almost candied in that way, but really a lot of intensity, a lot of complexity in the wine. And I think it's really, really fantastic. This is an allocated wine, so we're only, this year we got more of it than we usually do. Some years we can only get like 3 bottles. This year we got a whole case, but since we got a whole case, that's why I'm taking this wine with me. I don't know when we'll be able to get it again.
Amber?
Yes.
This is Rick. Unfortunately, I've got to check out here in a second, but one question, did you say that in your opinion, the Turley Zin is produced in a Burgundian fashion?
Yes. I think as far as Zinfandel goes, and that's also kind of, you know, they sell it in a more of a Burgundy shaped bottle too. And I think that that's intentional for them, that they want to show that they're trying to make the wine in a style that really shows a sense of place. And that's sort of one of the things that I mean by Burgundian. They do have, I mean, Turley makes almost 40 different bottlings of wine.
Right.
So, you know, can't really generalize that all of the wines are of a place, because they have just old vine of California. You know, they have juvenile wine of California. Old vine is vines that are in vineyards that maybe they've just taken over the farming contract for, and they don't necessarily, they're always more than 40 years. They're usually between like 48 and 120 years of age. but
Right.
maybe they don't have enough of them to make a single vineyard designate wine. So they'll put those into a blend and sell that. And then the juvenile is when they replant specific vines in vineyards. They'll actually pick those separately and blend them together so they don't go into their single vineyard designate or their old vine blend. So they're very, very terroir focused.
I find that very interesting because I find that there's a lot of fruit and just a little more lush than the typical Burgundian.
Well, I would 100% agree.
I understand it's Pinot rather than Zin, but
that's what I would say. I 100% agree with you. But I think the idea of the Burgundian is more about the focus on farming and the focus on terroir. And you notice that too, because that's another thing about, as I mentioned, like, are you saying Syrah or Shiraz? Are you saying grape grower or wine grower? Are you putting your Zinfandel in a Burgundy bottle, or are you putting your Zinfandel in a Bordeaux bottle? Because that can actually, in a way, if you know that, tell you a little bit about what you might expect in the bottle. And sometimes it's just chance. Maybe sometimes it doesn't matter, but oftentimes it does.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Great class. Sorry that I have to leave a bit early.
No, we're jumping off too. So
I'll see you next week for the Burgundy class.
That sounds great.
Okay.
So thanks everybody. It's kind of
Thanks,
fun.
Amber.
Thank you. It's always fun to have a class where we get to chat about something a little bit different and bring attention to growers and producers we love. And I'll definitely follow up with some of those tomorrow as well. Have a great night, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Amber.
Happy Monday.
Yeah. Good start to the week, right?
Bye.